Rory and Shamil, I'm going to hand over now to you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for listening and hope to see you all very soon.
Right. Now, because this is a podcast being recorded live, I've got to start. I assume I don't have to wait for the countdown clock. Is that fair, Shamil?
I don't know, Rory. I think it's. I think we're okay. I think that's counting down our session. So I think we're live and on.
It's now counting down our session. I thought I might have committed a huge gaffe there, but I think we're okay. Now, this is an extraordinary case. I've just got to start with a little podcast introduction because it's required for people listening later. So I've got to say, before I start fanboying like crazy, I mean, the previous speaker, the announcer, just said we've all missed human contact. To be absolutely honest, I haven't very much. I'm a bit of an introvert. The only two things I've really missed during lockdown are pubs and Indian restaurants. You know, sitting with a load of people in an open plan office, to be quite honest, I can take it or leave it. But pubs and Indian restaurants are the only two things you can't really replace in the virtual world. I'm sure there are people currently trying. But hello and welcome to Rory Sutherland's On Brand, brought to you by ALF Insight. In each episode, we'll be bringing together big names from the world of advertising, marketing and media to dissect and debate success, ingenuity, and the future possibilities for our industry. And today, as part of the Mad Anywhere virtual event, we're talking to Shamil Thakrar, who's the co-founder of Dishoom, not worthy. Okay? Now, the interesting thing is, it's not really, as actually, I mean, the whole concept of Indian restaurant is very weird because much of the food we experience and describe as Indian is, for example, highly atypical of Indian food. And your food is also slightly an outlier in the sense that it's as much Iranian or Zoroastrian in its origins as it is originally Indian. Is that fair?
It is. We do have a lot of Irani food on our menus, but it's not strictly Iranian. It is Zoroastrian, and we also serve an awful lot of the food of Bombay. In general, I think our menu probably is Bombay comfort food, and in fact, even the food that is served in Irani cafes that we serve, especially for breakfast, for example, is really Indian. You know, I mean, it's now sort of assimilated into Bombay, and I think we've always taken sort of inspiration from finding those really good dishes in Bombay, which may not be mainstream in the UK, but we love, and we want to bring somehow the best versions of the ones we've tasted. So we think hard about where all the different dishes are, and then bring them to you. And I think it probably is all Bombay comfort food in the end. It's the stuff that certainly gives us comfort.
And part of your motivation for founding the chain, it was founded as a single restaurant in Covent Garden, which I've been to many, many times. You've now got 4 in London. I think you've got Edinburgh, Birmingham, and Manchester as well. So for all you sort of metropolitan snowflakes out of there, you now know you can actually leave London and still get, assured decent food. So that's good news for all you folks. Now, the interesting thing is you started as a single restaurant in Covent Garden, and you were partly driven, I suppose, by an irrational hatred of flock wallpaper, weren't you? That you felt that the presentation of kind of Indian culture in Britain had become rather tired and hackneyed. And part of your motivation was to kind of fight against this, rather lazy stereotype that had emerged. Tell me how you do it.
I think that's true, although I have to acknowledge a massive debt to flock wallpaper, because I think that what we do stands very firmly on the shoulders of curry houses and the curry house tradition, because I think that it's only because of the familiarity of Indian cuisine, and it is Indian cuisine, although, there's some stories around the Silhetis and being Bangladeshi food, it is Mughlai cuisine. We stand on those shoulders, and I think the familiarity with the ingredients and the familiarity with the taste means that we can do what we do, and it is therefore something that people like. And I think that certainly when we were first thinking about, for me, a lot of it is cultural as much as food, and thinking about the representation of India in popular culture in the UK. And today we might say there were tropes. That's a sort of quite a fashionable word. So the tropes were curry house, Bollywood, cricket, Days of the Raj, palaces. That's sort of it. Bollywood, maybe. Did I say that? And I think there was no room for other more sort of sensible understanding or nuanced understanding of Indian culture. And there was so much to be said about Bombay, particularly about Indian food and Indian culture in general. And so I wanted to find those dishes that you can't find on British curry house menus. I wanted to find that way of speaking about our culture. And in a way, it was a discovery for my own heritage as well, and understanding myself in the context of me being here in the UK as someone of Indian origin. But bringing that together and sort of then challenging the perceptions of Indian culture and saying there's a lot more to be said. And this whole idea of Irani cafes and the heritage of immigrants coming from Iran, Persia back then, Zoroastrians to Bombay, settling there in the early 20th century and welcoming everyone in. It seemed just a lovely platform to use to tell stories about Bombay, to tell stories about heritage, about the food, and to bring people in. And it felt sort of good and fresh and different.
And you've certainly done that. I mean, you have a really interesting approach to opening every new restaurant, which is you create a kind of backstory about who the founder might be, who his family might be. So you actually, in the same way that a character in a Hollywood movie might have a backstory written, none of which ever appears on screen, but it's to help the actor understand the character. You do the same when you create a new restaurant, if I'm right. That's astonishing. Tell me a bit more.
Yeah, well, I think I do it because I like doing it. I'm not sure if I think it is helpful, of course, but we believe it is. I think that if you're trying to express something, if you're expressing, you're trying to create a design, in a way, it's much better to use something which is detailed and nuanced, even though it may not be visible to guests and customers who eat there. I don't think it really matters. And what we do is I will always think of a fictional protagonist, someone who might have done something or been somewhere, or one of these Iranis who's created an Irani cafe or has come, some circumstances in an Irani cafe. And then we use that story to build the restaurant. So the designers get that brief, the builders, everyone sees that brief, and then we communicate it. And for example, our King's Cross restaurant, we imagine a guy who's wandering around in Bombay in 1928, and he's around Victoria Terminus, which is similar to King's Cross, St Pancras rather, which is a big Gothic building. And he's wandering around there in 1928. He's just arrived, maybe fresh off the boat. He's quite entrepreneurial, has this sort of energy, sees this big sort of warehouse, which is what our King's Cross restaurant was in the 1860s in the UK as built as. And he sees this warehouse and thinks, here are men and machines and animals, there's stuff, I can sell chai here. So he bribes the guards, sells some chai, maybe he bribes them again a few weeks later, builds a kitchen, builds a little seating area, and eventually 20 years later, he's taken over the whole place. And what is nice about that for me is that I get to tell the story of Indian independence, because those were the predominant events between 1928 and 1948, when we imagine this restaurant cafe takes over this big warehouse space. And I really like the idea of telling the story of independence in a space which was built in 1860, a real space, which is the goods shed in King's Cross, that was used to interchange goods from rail, road, and sort of canal for the empire, essentially. So this was a sort of a place where empire happened. And now I quite like building this cafe in there, which was in the empire. But what we've done then is the whole stories that we tell, the artwork is all anti-colonial. So there's graffiti on Indian independence, that there's a huge sign which is 5 meters high saying "Go Back Simon," which is a protest against the Simon Commission of 1928, which we found in archives. It's a big contemporaneous 1928 piece of graffiti. So all of this comes alive. And as you say, maybe people don't know it, but I love the irony of having a 5-meter piece of anti-colonial graffiti in what was essentially a colonial building in 1860. And maybe it's just fun for me, but it does, I think, give you a very different sense of space and being somewhere, even though you might not be consciously realizing it.
It is an extraordinary space and very, very different from any Indian restaurant you've ever encountered before. Indeed, I'd recommend you go there and have a look around, even if you don't like Indian food. Obviously, if you don't like Indian food, you lose quite a lot of my respect and any employment prospects with me. But nonetheless, even if you don't like Indian food, it's absolutely worth visiting. And what it also does, which I think is interesting, is one of the things that used to drive me nuts, there was a kind of artificial ceiling placed on what you could charge for different cuisines. So with French food, for some reason, which is not nearly as good as Indian food, as we all know, the sky was the limit. People would regard it as perfectly reasonable to go out and spend 3 figures on a French meal. And yet with Indian food, they just had this artificial mental ceiling around the sort of 25, 30 pound a head mark. Now, what you've done, I think, is very interesting, because you haven't gone wildly upmarket, It's undoubtedly a premium price restaurant. You know, there are probably limits to how far you can scale realistically, but nonetheless, you've also managed to scale and break through that price ceiling, I think, incredibly successfully, which was, I think, something that was long overdue. Because I always found it a problem with client entertaining, because, you know, you can't quite take a really senior client to an inexpensive curry house, not because it isn't good, but because it doesn't seem expensive enough. And you finally provided me with a gorgeous outlet here where I can actually get some decent food while I'm providing someone with hospitality. And the way you've done it, I think, is truly magnificent, because there are little details in that King's Cross restaurant. Like, I think there are little graffitos as well, aren't there, kind of in the toilets and so forth, which are kind of, pre-independence era graffiti appears. And then there are lovely little kind of echoes of kind of previous laws and social norms and other messages. And it is a very, very rich experience. I absolutely love it. So what are your plans? Interestingly, I had a conversation with, and he was also of Indian origin, actually, the marketing director of Yum Brands and Pizza Hut. And his dream has always been, or his great question is, why has no one actually created a sort of chain out of Indian food? So you have this incredibly innovative sector where one of my favorite Indian restaurants keeps its takeaway menu is only a partial representation of the full menu, because they don't want other restaurants stealing their signature dishes, for example. So you have this incredibly syncretic culture where people are borrowing, stealing, inventing, experimenting all over the place. And yet it's always remained at sort of 1, 2, or 3 outlets at most, and often not under the same brand. Where do you think, and Yum Brands are always asking this question, could we do the same thing, essentially, and do this at some larger scale? What do you think the potential is there? Or do you think it will always remain something which is an artisan restaurant, essentially?
Well, for us, I guess I really love every time we open a restaurant to deepen the idea of the brand and what we do. And I think there's 2 different routes you could go down. And I think branding is surely, at some level, it's economic, right? So the reason I have a brand is because I can do the work, do the design work, do the positioning work. And next time I open a restaurant, that the brand is resonant with people, so they can come in, and I don't have to do all that work again or build up the reputation, but they will come in because it is that brand. And before long, you've got 300 of these things, and you scale because you put the investment into the brand. So I think a brand there's a huge economic incentive to build a brand, but we don't use that as our motivation. We don't exploit that, because every time we open a restaurant, we have to do this flipping work of creating a new story. And so it doesn't work that way. So you could take one approach, which is what Jeremy King does at Corbett & King. He's amazing. Writes a story every time and builds Fishers, builds the Wolseley, builds the Delaney. And I hadn't realized he does stories too until much later, and we've discussed them quite a lot. They're brilliant. But what we do is take the same brand and deepen it every time. And I think that means that it obviously puts a bottleneck on how fast we can do things. But we got rid of logos. I think they're really old school. I don't like them. We have a different typeface for every single restaurant, which makes sense in the context of that story. And then, for example, I don't know if you came to it, but we did the immersive theatre production in Dishoom, Kensington, where the protagonist was a guy called Cyrus Irani, who's a cross between Carlito from Carlito's Way and Rick from Casablanca. And he leaves prison, and he's a bit of a rogue, but he's a lovely guy. Leaves prison, having made some money. He's got his money. He buys an old cinema, which is defunct, turns that into a jazz club come restaurant, has a beautiful girlfriend who sings jazz, and opening night, he greets you. For the first 2 weeks, we didn't open as a restaurant. We opened as an immersive theatre production. We had some punch-drunk people write the script and help us with all the production. And so you walk into this story, and literally you spend 2 hours in the company of Cyrus Irani, who would greet you, bring you in, give you drinks. The cops might interrogate you. There was some violence and some stuff. We wrote music for it. But I think that what I love about that is that every time we do something, we get to deepen it a bit, deepen it more. So I think we'll always be a bit artisanal because we love doing that. But at the same time, I think what's quite nice about it is that we get to put all sorts of things into the brand, all sorts of stories attached into the brand. We released a record with Dishoom Carnaby, which is 1960s music. And we spent a lot of time with the musicians who made music in Bombay at the time. And that was great fun too. We went quite deep into that. And we've got other ideas to do this thing. But this storytelling thing, I think, is something that's very resonant and very deep. And I think allows you to take branding in a very, very different sort of feeling and direction. So for me, it really hangs on that for us, that we can sort of manage to grow, not that fast, and we'll keep it fairly sort of contained, but we can deepen it as we go. I don't know if I answered your question, but I enjoy talking about the immersive theatre production.
No, I mean, I just think that possibly, in the areas, the catchment areas around London, there's a huge opportunity for exactly this kind of food, which is, it's very interesting, actually. I'm sorry to digress a little bit, but The Spectator asked me about a year ago, when they had their 10,000th edition, to go and review all the advertising from The Spectator over from its foundation in 1828.
Yeah.
And one of the most extraordinary things I noticed, I'd always thought of the Indian restaurant as 1950s phenomenon. When my father was at university, there was one Indian restaurant. He became a lifetime convert. And then it, of course, occurred to me that restaurants, to some extent, weren't actually that numerous in the 19th century. What I discovered in The Spectator, going back to the early 19th century, was an unbelievable profusion of advertisements for Indian spices, condiments, and herbs. And I realized that actually this tradition of English people eating Indian food is much, much older than we think, because there must have been a whole bunch of Raj returnees who are going, God, I can't face eating this bland crap for the rest of my life. And so there was this extraordinary market.
You read that? It's very good.
Oh, glorious. Yeah. It's William Dalrymple's book, is it? Yeah.
Yeah, very
and
good.
You suddenly realize that coming back from India and being faced with a lifetime of pretty bland, overboiled vegetables must have been like a kind of purgatory. And the whole Spectator was packed with these ads for extraordinary exotic. I mean, actually, Worcester sauce emerged from an Indian recipe that the guy brought back. He retired to Worcester, took a recipe to his local chemist, who were called Lee and Perrins, and he got them to make it up. And it was apparently totally disgusting. And so they forgot all about it. And then they left a barrel in the cellar. And 10 years later, they tried it, and it was Worcester sauce, essentially. And so you realize that this is actually much, much older. And I think the latent demand here is for a different kind of food and a different kind of dining experience is colossal. Do you get tempted? I mean, there's always the danger of overexpansion, but do you get tempted to sort of dream of 100 outlets or 150? Or do you think that there's only so far you can stretch?
We do certainly think about it. And I think there's a couple of issues for that with us. I mean, orthodoxy back in 2014, in restaurants, and we're not in 2014, we're in 2021, which is really, really different for all sorts of reasons, but was raise a lot of cash, simplify your concept and expand it. And all the clever people said that, is that you've got a great concept now, you've got a couple of outlets, you should simplify, scale it and sell it. And we just decided not to do that. And I think that, so I think actually in this particular case, what happened was we were so committed to making sure that the experience was wonderful for both team member and customer, and that we wanted to sort of, let's monetize that. Let's make it brilliant, but then monetize that. Let's not be focused on the profit. So let's make money by focusing on sort of the quality of the experience. That I think that became our culture. And I think in this particular case, culture just trumps strategy. I'd like to say it was strategic that we grew slowly, but I don't think it was. I think it was because we couldn't face opening terrible restaurants, and I wanted to write a story every time and make them wonderful, because it is a bit of a process. And I think in the end, possibly, if you take people from our vintage, some really, really great brands, things like Byron or Pulpo, which I used to love, but brands that did try and scale and expand. And I think in the end, we ended up doing a decent job of getting quite big revenue-wise, but without that many outlets. And I think we're sort of managing to, touch wood, it's really difficult, and I love those businesses, but we're managing to sustain what we do. So I don't think we paid a penalty in the end on actual growth. I mean, I think we hit, before the pandemic, we were up at about 55 million of revenue, and I think we'll hopefully hit that again, post the pandemic. And so I think we managed to sort of do that. The mantra that really helped us to slow down, but at the same time to make sure that our sales per square foot were brilliant, i.e. restaurants are really, really busy, was deepen, don't dilute. So it's deepen with a comma, deepen, comma, don't dilute. And so every time we open, every time we design a restaurant, every time we serve a dish, every time we have a service experience, we think it should be better than the last one. And if we can achieve that, then I think we can grow actually very well, but it might appear slow in terms of units, but I don't really mind that. That wasn't what we were after in the first place. So there are definitely siren calls, to get funded and grow fast, but we resist them because it doesn't work for us.
And of course, in terms of revenue, you've cracked something which was pretty much, to mix religious metaphors, the holy grail of the Indian restaurant industry, which was you're full 3 times a day, essentially. Now, this business of introducing breakfast, my hunch as a sort of behavioral science nerd is that it has a knock-on effect. That one of the reasons Indian restaurants are empty at lunchtime is because they're empty at lunchtime. You look in, they're empty. You think, well, I better not go in there. And quite a lot of these instinctive things. Now, one of the interesting things is by offering what is arguably, I think, well, actually, undoubtedly one of London's best breakfasts. If anybody hasn't had breakfast at Dishoom, you're missing out. Okay, but one of the interesting things it seems to do is it seems to pump prime people going in, because the assumption was, Annette King lost a lot of my respect by saying nobody eats Indian food at lunchtime, to which I pointed out that 1.4 billion Indians seem to manage to do it quite satisfactorily. But one of the interesting things you've managed to do is the 3 meal, effectively you each restaurant, which is in quite expensive real estate, is pretty packed out for breakfast, is pretty full for lunch, and is obviously extremely full. In many cases, there's a queue at dinner time. Now, do you think that was the breakfast thing that was actually a killer there, that there was a kind of path dependency of filling the restaurant? Because the great curse of an Indian restaurant, I once said it as a graduate question for graduate applicants to Ogilvy, which is how can you get people to eat at Indian restaurants at lunchtime? And you seem to be the only place that's really solved that. And I'm intrigued to know more.
Well, the answer is if you want to fill an Indian restaurant at lunch, you serve them breakfast. And I know that people, I think people in 2008, when I was thinking about starting Dishoom, thought I was an idiot, because why would I leave my secure employment at Bain and Company to do something like launch an Indian restaurant? I know friends of my father were like, this is ridiculous. You're going to open a curry house. That's regressing. You've been educated and you're doing stuff, and now you're going backwards to opening a curry house.
Trust me, there is no way you can benefit humanity more than by leaving a management consultancy to open an Indian restaurant. There's nothing that touches that in terms of public good, I think. So, congratulations for that. Yeah.
Well, it's been a lovely folks, and I learned a lot of stuff. But so then when I tell them that I want to open an Indian restaurant, they'd say, fine, that's pretty stupid. It's 2008, Lehman's just crashed. Why would you do that? Like, we don't need more Indian restaurants. And then eventually I'd tell them that we're going to have a really busy breakfast. They would write me off, of course, because it made no sense. I mean, on the face of it, having a business plan with a breakfast in it, I don't know if the business plan had breakfast in it, but thinking you were going to launch a business breakfast, an Indian breakfast, seems insane. But I think maybe a couple of things were behind it. One was definitely the thinking that if you manage to get people in for breakfast, you'll fill the whole place. There was this very big taboo around Indian food for lunch that we were consistently warned about, that people won't come in because it's smelly, it's the office, and why would you want to smell that way?
They're lower than vermin. I know, I come across this all the time. It's ridiculous. But carry on. Yeah.
Well, we were sort of humble and understood it, or tried to, and took it on board and said, well, what we could do is persuade them to come in for breakfast, and we'll invest in really good extract, which we did. We over-specified the extract, so the place smelled fine. It didn't have that stale smell that you do get sometimes after spices. So we over-invested in that, and we wanted the place to feel like a cafe. That was really important. So Iranic cafes were cafes, and this was not curry house, it was cafe. And cafe was a place that was all day bustling, serving, doing stuff. And then when you hit breakfast, it repositioned, I think. And I think people were like, this does breakfast. I wouldn't eat in a curry house for breakfast. Therefore, this isn't a curry house. And I mean, honestly, though, it was me and my co-founder, Gubby, sitting in the restaurant for months and weeks on end, staring at our bacon naan rolls, just the two of us. And eventually we sort of got to, I think we got to £1,000 a week was our break even, cash-wise, which we told ourselves it was. I don't know what it was. And we did some sort of probably spurious calculations. And my sort of wildest dreams was £2,000 a week. This is our first restaurant in Covent Garden. And eventually, I think we got up to sort of 15 or I think 20,000, maybe £20,000 a week. So fully 20% of our customers now come in for breakfast, maybe a bit more than that, 25%. And I think we do about 55% of our trade before 5 or 6 p.m., which is really, really weird for an Indian restaurant. But I think it was I don't know if it was it wasn't a guaranteed thing. We had to really work hard at it and be persistent, and it was quite humbling. It took a while.
I must add that to my list, actually, of things that don't make sense except in retrospect, which is I always have this problem with, actually, I suppose this is one of the things that, coming from a Bain background, it must have been difficult for you to do something counterintuitive, because all the market analysis would suggest there is no market for Indian food at breakfast and at lunchtime. And so, in the best consulting tradition, you're supposed to respond to that. And I always argue that there are far more good ideas out there that you can post-rationalize than there are good ideas you can pre-rationalize. And that some sort of, what you might call fairly dedicated experimentation, as you did there, genuinely paid off. I mean, if only, nobody, as far as I know, has yet replicated it, but it's an extraordinary thing because it changes the whole economics of the business.
It's brilliant. Yeah, and the positioning, the differentiation. We did so much marketing around, we don't do real marketing, but we just plugged the bacon naan roll a lot. And it really resonated. And I think that because we got so much sort of PR out of that, and so many people came along and said, wow, this is like a national dish, but somehow you managed to reinvent it and we cheated, of course, because all naan is made to order. So it's very, very fresh. We put some chili jam into it and some cream cheese, and it tasted fantastic. And suddenly everyone was like, this is really cheap and lovely, and we can just go there regularly. I might come back for dinner.
Okay, there's a bit less on the description, so I'm starting to make pervy facial expressions now at you describing this thing. I can actually, funnily enough, this is rather a nice segue, which is that my PA actually bought her husband for his 50th birthday I think it's the bacon naan roll. She managed to have it delivered. Now, I understand you've effectively, under lockdown, not only have you, by the way, and I want to say this because I know that you're probably too modest to mention, you cooked an unbelievable number of meals for the NHS under lockdown, if that's right.
Yeah, we have.
I might start volunteering as a health worker, knowing that. I didn't know. So tell us about that, and also tell us about how you had to kind of essentially invent a delivery business, which was never part of your intention, and also a food kit business, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, we've been pivoting like crazy, like basketball players. I mean, it's I've come to resent that word, pivot. It sounds so easy, and it's really not. I mean, on the first bit, I think when the pandemic first hit, we obviously had to think about safety of our customers and safety of our team. And once you address that, you think about cash and whether you're going to die. And then we thought, once we've addressed that, we obviously do have to think strategically, but we can help here. So we got involved pretty fast. And in the first pandemic, we did a lot of cooking for the NHS and just sent stuff to hospitals. This time around, we'll be doing even more and in touch with individual hospitals and individual vaccination centers where we've just sort of sent them food, just dumped food on them. And that sometimes it's that they haven't been able to process it with their sort of health and safety requirements, but generally they've loved it and been able to receive it. I think we're up to 20 or 30,000 meals, just in the last few months that they've sort of been eating. And I think it really helps because it's pretty miserable in the NHS. It's better now, but it's been bad. We've also hit a milestone. It's quite deep for us. We hit a milestone of for every meal we serve in the restaurants, we donate a meal to a child, either in the UK or in India. We did that from 2015. So we've just passed 10 million meals to children over the last 5 years, which is a sort of wonderful milestone that we passed during the pandemic. But once we sort of stabilized the business, at least thought we had enough cash, which I don't know if we did, it was quite hairy. We thought, right, what should we do here to be creative and create more cash for ourselves and potentially have a business that we could keep? And delivery was a difficult decision in some ways, easy in others, because I just have never wanted to do delivery. I thought what we do is we provide experiences to people who come into the restaurant. And in fact, we're going to go the other way. The strategy was to go in the absolute opposite direction and not do delivery and bring people into a physical space, which is beautiful, and we serve them. And yet in the pandemic, the logic of delivery was very compelling. We had to reduce our cash burn, which was not insignificant. We were burning an enormous amount. I think at one point, a run rate of burn of about £10 million a year. So that was sort of the worst point before we were managing to do any generation of revenue and mitigate that. So we ended up we've opened delivery kitchens. We've opened 8 delivery kitchens. And the thinking has been that, look, we can't get to you, so we're going to bring you awesome food at home during the pandemic. And we are going to make sure that what we're giving to you is a wonderful delivery experience, which brings you back into the restaurants. And fundamentally, the restaurants are what we do, but creating a fantastic taste of what we do. We're working very hard on the experience. And we did a lot of benchmarking from around the world. We've looked at delivery in South Korea, in Melbourne, in San Francisco, LA, Berlin and looked at all the best ideas and said, let's knit those into what we do and use that also as an opportunity for storytelling, for engaging. So we're still working quite hard on the packaging and the experience. And we also chopped off all the dishes that didn't travel. So it's quite a reduced menu. So it's much smaller. But those dishes that we send you do travel well. So dal is maybe even better out of delivery, and it's even better the next day, actually. The chicken curry is delicious. The biryanis are delicious. We're not sending you grills because they taste terrible. Naan we do send you, but we might start sending you little dough balls, which you can make your own naan, so you can choose which one to have, like the naan kit. And the business has been, it's taken off. It's really good. So now we're thinking about how to think about the cannibalization, different channels. Can both businesses exist together? And I think our conclusion is we could keep the business on the other side, but it's got to be brilliant. You know, it can't. It's got to be a window into the restaurant. It's got to seduce you into the restaurant. And I think we can make that happen. And then the meal kits business, again, it's another sort of pivot. We thought, what fun to make a bacon naan roll at home. And if you can make a naan on your pan and under your grill, it's fairly simple, but it's really good fun. It's quite theatrical as this naan billows up, and you put bacon on it, and it's working pretty well. We're now, I think we're doing half of our revenue in a lockdown state as we were in an open state. And I think we're almost close to covering all of our cash burn. So we're just through these couple of new businesses, which are working pretty well.
So I suppose the possibility exists to create one of these dark kitchens, which seem to be all the rage at the moment, where essentially you're a delivery-only business and that the kitchen doesn't need to occupy the same expensive real estate. And so you can create a kind of, very different kind of business that way. Because I think also the meal kits, I've been quite a Gusto convert under lockdown, I have to say. And meal kits are particularly well suited to ethnic food because they often require small quantities of a very large range of ingredients. And so the whole question of food waste and the depth of the flavour is something you can achieve very well there. So I mean, I'd love to see that business continue, I have to say, just for purely selfish reasons. But the fact that it's making 50% of what you made when restaurants were allowed to open is really testament to how much I think people were missing you, apart from anything else. That's really extraordinary.
Yeah. It's really lovely, and I'm sort of humble about it because I think it may not stay. So we're investing in it now. We're working on increasing that business, and I have no doubt that it will take a decline when we get out of restaurants. And I hope we fill up the restaurants again. But equally, it seems to be working now. We're investing in it. We're going to bring out new SKUs. We've just launched a mimosa kit, so you can have a sausage, a bacon naan roll plus mimosas. It's a grapefruit marmalade mimosa. It's delicious. So it sort of seems to be getting traction. I really hope it stays. I think it's a nice thing to have as a consumer as well.
Any chance of a gimlet kit? He said selfishly. That's one of your we did Shoreditch restaurant. That's one of my all-time favourites. Yeah, the gimlet. I was just suggesting, that a few of those might be worth good high margin stuff. And I'll be your first customer happily for that. That sounds fantastic.
No, you're too late to be the first customer. We've already done it. So I'm going to send you it's a gimlet, Negroni, and old-fashioned kit. I suppose it's just bottle cocktails. They're pretty nice. Yeah.
Oh, this is astonishing. I mean, the interesting thing is a little bit of your family story is very interesting because you've got an MBA from Harvard. And so I can just imagine what it must be like in a family where you've got a Harvard MBA and you say, I'm going into the restaurant industry. I can imagine, as you say, that might achieve a little bit of pushback. Originally, you came from India via Uganda, which was one of those cases where Idi Amin's loss was our gain. Of which there are probably, 50,000 such examples, I would argue. And then you ended up, I think the family was in Leicester for a time, is that right? Where your uncle started, is it right, Tilda Rice, is that right?
Well, my grandfather and father and uncles, yeah, indeed.
Yes. And so, so you worked there, then it was Harvard Business School, is that right? Then Bain, is that right? Or were you at Bain before HBS for a bit?
Bain before Tilda, so after HBS. Yeah, it's a bit garbled, but more or less, yeah. So I learned some stuff, then came to Tilda, but then decided I had a sort of urge of my own to create something fresh. And business school and Bain are wonderful experiences, and they teach you a lot. I think they're in my view, they're very good slaves, very good tools, but less good masters. They don't tell you what to do or where to go, but it really is very good at helping you think through how to execute things, to giving you a sort of ready set of tools to understand, to analyze. But I think the sort of for me, fundamentally, and Rory, some of your stuff has been very helpful on this. Business is about the way you make somebody feel. It's about the emotional connection you create. I think both with your team member and also your guest, and reframing how somebody feels when they enter a space or when they eat some food is the power. Is how you get people to. There's an author friend of mine who says that you read a book and you stay with the book because you like the author's voice. And you stay with that voice. You love the voice. I think it's the same with a business, actually. You like the voice of the business. And if I can do all the little things around the place that reframe how you feel and you enjoy that, and you might call it voice, then I think you'll keep coming back. And I think that has to be for the team member and for the employee and for the guest. And somehow I didn't learn that at business school or Bain, but if once you've got that and you put that at the center, there's an awful lot of very useful tools that will help you to express that and to scale that into 8 restaurants with 1,000 people.
No, I think that's very interesting, which is, I suppose there's always a dangerous tendency in business schools to function on what is easily focus on what is easily quantified. And of course, those things like tone of voice, actually, we have to give, I think we probably agree, Richard Caring as a restaurateur deserves credit for that as well. That every time, he takes over a place, it's very fashionable, I'm sure, within the restaurant industry to dislike him because he takes over venerable brands and kind of scales them up. But I always notice that somehow he manages to maintain that kind of tonality, which is very, very hard to quantify. But it really makes the difference between a good restaurant and a great one, I think. And one of the things I always remember Drayton Bird saying to me something very surprising, which you never expect to hear in an ad agency. And Drayton said once, he said, to be honest, he said, I find that communications to the trade are more effective than communications to the consumer, and communications to your own staff are the most important of all. And actually, Caring would be the same there. Your relationship with the team members is probably very, very different to that which commonly pertains in, London restaurant scene, where you tend to have, I think, longer tenure and, some sort of sense of real security and a real relationship. And the consumer notices that, I think, even if it's very hard to put on a spreadsheet. Anything particularly, any tips you give us in terms of how you arrange that?
I think I do. I've got a couple of thoughts. One very conceptual. So one is that I think if you want to make money and maximize profit, you shouldn't be thinking about maximizing profit. Maybe there's a book called Obliquity, which I haven't read, which says that
it's fantastic.
It's good. I've got it. It's around on my shelf, and I want to read it. But I think we focus on.
It's John Kay. It's fantastic. Yeah. Absolutely fantastic. Well, it's almost any creative person listening, it's one of the first books you should read, that actually the way to achieve something is not to pursue it directly. Yeah. So carry on. Sorry,
it resonates so well with it. If you focus on awesome food and drink, awesome service and a happy team, this was our sort of insight, and you control the cost because you have to do that. And then you treat revenue and profit as the applause that follows from doing a good job. And we've reframed everything in the business, all the reporting. We don't have a dashboard. We have a jantri. The jantri is a word that an Indian astrologer uses when he names your baby, these sort of stupid charts that he uses. And we have a jantri, which starts at the top with maximize, obsess over these measures, which fundamentally is around guest welfare and team welfare. We've begun to think of team welfare even before that. So I think that the first thing you have to do is stick it right at the top of your list, above profit. And of course, you have to control your costs. Of course, you have to build a decent business model. But once you've done that, to drive the business model, stick team welfare right up at the top. That's the first thing. So once you've crossed that sort of conceptual bridge of saying this is what's important and this is how we're going to make money, not by focusing on the money, then I think there's lots of things that you can do, which are probably a bit more prosaic, but they're really, really important. I mean, we spend an awful lot of time really thinking about how we engage our team. Whether it's, I still spend 2 hours with every new person who joins the business. And there's quite a lot of them, taking them through the whole Dishoom story and why we do what we do and the bits about Bombay. So if you stay at Dishoom for 5 years, we take you on something called the Bombay Boot Camp, where we show you all the best bits of Bombay. We take you around all the restaurants and all the cafes. We take general managers and head chefs. And in fact, the last Bombay Boot Camp, Kavi and I put this into place when we were 2 or 3 years old. We said, well, we'll take people if they stay for 5 years. They'll never stay for 5 years. And last time we went, we took 35 people. This time we've got 110 people to take. I don't know how we're going to do that. But really focusing on that as a real measure which is staff welfare, happiness. But I think it just pays back in massive buckets. You just do it all the time, be there every day, focus on it. And there's a cliche, which is if culture is not at the top of your list, it's not on your list. You really have to be obsessed. Every day you have to get up and I do a lot of repeating. I think the job of a leader often is to think of the things to say in a conceptually sensible way and then just say them a lot. And I find myself saying things a lot and guiding that. But it really pays back in sort of buckets and dividends. We got to number 20 in the Times Top 100 list, and we're entering this year. We've done an awful lot of work in the pandemic with our teams. I lead a yoga class every 2 weeks, which is quite good fun. But we do lots and lots of things, which I think have really helped us. So we're going to enter again this year, and I hope we can improve our place. But it's so important to do.
I have to say I find this incredibly impressive. I think that one of the things which I think has been a characteristic of business I've noticed since I joined in 1988, which is that there's been a kind of assumption that that staff are kind of fungible, that they're replaceable, and it doesn't matter whether you have 5 people each staying for 1 year or one person staying for 5. I think the difference between the two is almost, chalk and cheese. It's immeasurably great, and I think it fundamentally changes the relationship. There's a very interesting insight I heard from somebody who gave a talk, who's the chief operating officer of Shopify. And one of the things he does is he said, I got a lot of stick for this because in the customer service teams, I put them into teams of 10. And the reason I put them into teams of 10 is because essentially, if you look at sport, there's something about the human evolved mind, which means cricket's 11, soccer's, I call it soccer, there we go, football's 11, then, rugby's 15. There's something about that size of group. And he got a lot of flack because they said, well, you're going to have high middle management costs. What about the possibility of scale? But his discovery was that you achieve by actually having smaller teams where everybody knows everybody else and the part they play in the team. You get a kind of total football there, which you don't get when you try and scale up. And I have to say, I'm not vilifying your time spent at Bain, but I think that quite a lot of consulting activity has focused on what you might call fairly shallow ideas of efficiency and cost saving without fully accounting for what you lose to obtain these apparent efficiency gains. Yeah. Do you think that's possibly fair that actually one of the things Bain would probably have, I'm being unfair, let's not name Bain, because I've got quite a few friends there, and as you're quite right, it's a very nice place. But I think there is a wider consulting problem, which is, I call this the doorman fallacy, which is you go to a hotel and you define the doorman's role in a way that makes it, for example, highly amenable to automation. So you say the doorman's job is to open the door, and therefore we can replace him with an automatic door opening mechanism and save the doorman's salary. And it looks perfectly logical in the way you've defined it, but actually what you find is 3 years later, your rack rate's fallen by 30%. There are vagrants asleep in the doorway, and most of your loyal customers have left because the doorman wasn't really about opening the door in the first place. He was about security, recognition, goodness knows what else. Yeah. And I think I can see a combination of consulting logic. Let's not always knock it, because in a field like logistics, it's probably a pretty good, approach. But combination between consulting logic and a certain kind of what you might call Silicon Valley, define people in a way that makes their functions suitable for automation, which generally I think undervalues or too narrowly defines every job. I can see those two forces acting in parallel to often obtain quite undesirable results in a way. And it's very interesting because, that... At some level, we...
Go ahead, Rory, after you, at some level.
At some level, it's the things you do that you don't have to do, which people really notice. And so defining, the value of something too narrowly and too functionally in a kind of deterministic way always ends up destroying the magic, because the magic comes... I had an Indian restaurant locally, which makes a fantastic palaver about boxing up the food in a delivery box that has a carry handle, okay, which also means it doesn't fall over in the boot of your car, which is always a bit of a plus. But, this would be the first thing someone in procurement would attempt to cut, but it's actually the thing that enables them to charge a kind of 20% premium in a funny kind of way. And I often think that there's there's a misalignment between cost and value, which is a very, it's a very, very dangerous thing, I think, in a business. And you've escaped that gloriously, I have to say.
I mean, I hope so. I think it sort of bites on two levels, doesn't it? One is sort of stuff in the business that is around the detail that would get stripped out. But the second, I think, is where you started, which is the people side of things. And I think that fundamentally, surely, and I think you get this at business school, maybe you get it in consulting, but you certainly get it at business school. But fundamentally, business is about people and relationships. And there's an enormous amount of research, which is, I don't know if you've come across the very longitudinal study at Harvard Medical School. There's a guy called Robert Waldinger who talks about it, and I've been fortunate to hear him speak, and he's a very impressive guy. But the research essentially says that to the extent that your relationships are good in your life, your old age, or even in fact your life, is just going to be healthier and happier. And they've got decades and decades of longitudinal data going back to I think the 1920s or 30s, and it just shows time and time again is that the most important thing for health and happiness is relationships. And I think that is the fuel that make things work. And in a business, you've got to give people time to create those relationships, understand each other. The muscle memory of being a barman and banging the drawer shut with your bum and sort of shaking, and the sort of being able to be around people you know and trust is magical. And I think that as restaurants, it can be seen as a bit frivolous. Eating out's a bit frivolous, isn't it? But it's really not, because we I think, when the pandemic has really, really sort of driven this home, but restaurants are places where you see people. Restaurants are places where you make eye contact with people in the real world and not on Zoom, and you forge relationships through that sort of space that you fill by talking and not talking. And I think that it's not just a thing that humans need to do. It's fundamental to who we are. Because I think we sort of maybe evolved being very social with each other. Those who weren't very social left the sort of cave or the fire and wandered off and got eaten by saber-toothed tigers. So it's in our DNA. It's advantageous together to come and cluster with people we trust. And I think not only do restaurants do that, but I think that having a team that does that is really the way I can foster wonderful environments where people can come together and create and enjoy their relationships. So I think I think we're all going to feel very relieved when we see each other again, but particularly around, if this is the proverbial fire of the cavemen, you gather around. It's what we've been doing for millennia. We gather around a fire and we eat and we sing, and it's deep. It's really in our DNA. So I think relationships and team is not in accounting. This is beyond that, and it can create a magic which can't be quantified, or maybe it can because you get the revenue, but you can't get the link in a specific way.
I think a lot of it's deeply unconscious. Nassim Taleb's very interesting on this, because people always say, I don't like it when a restaurant's too crowded, but actually they do. There's something there where logically, you might say, well, in a perfectly logical world, we'd like to go to a quiet restaurant where we're among only very few diners. But if you look at the reality of human behavior, people actually don't like that at all. It's completely the opposite. Who do you most admire? Who of your competitors? And it can be quite oblique, in indirect competitors as well. But is there any other business in anything from the high-end restaurant to the quick service restaurant category that you generally admire or look to?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I don't know. I'm so busy sort of implementing things at the moment that I haven't had time to think about them. I really do have an enormous amount of admiration for Jeremy Corbyn and King. I don't mean Jeremy Corbyn. I do mean Corbyn of Corbyn and King. Yeah, and he's Jeremy King, should I say, not Jeremy Corbyn at all. I'm sort of mixing up.
I was going to say, I think there are many ways Jeremy Corbyn could reinvent himself, but at a high-end restaurateur, I think he'd find that slightly awkward. Yeah, okay. Yeah,
very sort of classy restaurant. But Jeremy King is someone I really admire, and he really is about the evocation of a different time and a place, a detail, a dedication to the art of it. And I think in the end, as a restaurateur, maybe in any consumer business, you've got to be dedicated to the thing, not to the money, because I think then you can monetize the thing. Just as Johnny Ive is obsessed by the edge of the MacBook and gets to therefore monetize that in a spectacular way, but he's not thinking about the profit; he's thinking about the edge of the MacBook. So I guess I really, really respect what Jeremy King does. But then also, even someone like Johnny Ive is enormously. I think he was quite inspiring. I've seen some of his lectures and keynotes, and just the way he is obsessed beyond the financial by making something brilliant, and then you get to monetize it. If you're passionate about it and you don't care about the money, you are entitled to monetize that. But when Dell says we need to create a great edge because it will get us market share, well, they're going to fail because they're not going to do it properly. Just as we couldn't do an immersive theatre production for brand values. I mean, I've got to do it because I love it.
I had to say, I once watched a Johnny Ive talk, and bear in mind, I love to nerd out on this stuff, but after about 20 minutes, I was thinking, I think we've probably heard enough about chamfers and bezels at this point, but the extent to which he could actually wax lyrical about some tiny detail of an edge or a curve is exactly, that's where the magic lies, essentially. And I find it I find it just really, really interesting. And I think also what it's done is that, there are a lot of people now talking about the future of London and where people are going to live and are people going to come into London 5 days a week. But I think through your distinctiveness, you've definitely created a business which is going to hold out remarkably well. Because, there are two things, I'll be candid from my own experience, okay? There are two things, when I travel into London, there are only two things I want to do, which you can't get in Tunbridge Wells or wherever else. And the two things I really miss, I have to admit, are the kebabs on the Edgware Road, particularly from Beirut Express or from Marouche. And it's actually, that actually is another business which could scale, I have to say. But one interesting trend I suppose, in British restaurant food is the rise of the high-end Turkish restaurant as well, isn't it? That's something comparatively new. Along with a very bizarre thing which fascinates me, which is that there seems to be a huge rise in Turkish men's barbers. And I had a row with an advertising planner about this because he was always saying, no, you can learn everything you need from research. And I said, let's be honest, I don't think 10 years ago there were lots of people in market research who would say, I really like my barber, but I just wish he'd flick burning methylated spirits into my ears. That's the thing I've been missing all along. And that's a fantastic thing, to discover a complete reinvention of a category.
Yeah.
And the high-end Turkish, there's a great one in Bromley, actually, which I can highly recommend. But that's another interesting, I suppose that's a competitor space which someone could probably expand. But this is all incredibly welcome. But I think one of the things you will do is you will hold up remarkably well because, again, out of distinctiveness. Even if, the nature of London slightly changes, the nature of commuting slightly changes, I think by creating this incredibly distinctive property, I don't think you'll see the queues disappearing anytime soon, I have to say. And that, by the way, is actually...
We're being quite humble about it, in a way. I'm assuming that we're going to have a great deal of difficulty because of people working from home. Which will reduce daytime. I think a lot of people have left London. They live in different places. EU people have left as well because of Brexit or because of the pandemic. And I think we're assuming we're going to have a problem. And I think the only way you should be is you sort of have to believe that your business is going to collapse tomorrow. You've got to go out there every day defending it and working hard to re-earn the trust of people and sort of get people back in. So we're reopening in May, when I hope we can reopen, with an intent to be much better than we were. So what I want people to do is to this is a slightly dodgy analogy, but bear with me. But if you last saw Die Another Day, that James Bond film where it's Pierce Brosnan, it's a bit of a ropey film, but then you come back and you see Casino Royale, and Daniel Craig emerges from the ocean with these great big pecs, and you're like, oh my God, Daniel, what have you been eating? I sort of want people to come back into Dishoom and go, oh my God, that's even better than I remember it. Look at those pecs. I'm stretching it too far. But I sort of want people to come back thinking, wow, this is even better than I remember it. And we're working internally on how we up our game and be even better. We're trying to be even better for the team, but then even better for the guest in terms of the food, the service, I want it to be a Daniel Craig experience.
Don't be too rude about Die Another Day, by the way, because I have a peculiar connection to that, which is the girl who dances naked in the opening sequence is actually my third cousin. Now, I don't know why I bothered pointing that out. You obviously would notice the obvious physical resemblance, I expect. But that's my little claim to fame there as far as the Bond franchise goes. You always remember that. Yeah, exactly. That's a bit of trivia you probably didn't need to know, is it? No, I understand exactly what you mean. In other words, it's a kind of the return is something which... Now, marketing spend, of course, for the restaurant category has plummeted. I think I've got the figures here, actually. Let me see. In 2020, the UK's biggest restaurants, their online and digital advertising spend was roughly 150 million. And that's 100 million less than it was in 2019, would you believe it or not? Now, I have to say, I mean, I think that's slightly risky. I think there is an argument to actually advertising even, I mean, the famous case being, I think, Wrigley's spearmint gum, which advertised during World War II, even though it wasn't available, in order to create pent-up demand when it should return. Yeah, I think we will probably see some, explosion in marketing and promotion. Any thoughts on that yourself? How do you promote yourself, or do you not need to? Is it entirely through word of mouth and repeat business? How do you promote yourself to? In a tourist site, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because you have to essentially make someone recognize a concept from scratch, more or less, as someone walking by. The queues obviously help, don't they? So queues are a marvelous, marvelous way of providing social proof. And Covent Garden, particularly, I think you served chai to people in the queue, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, we did the queue together. Do you remember once? That was, yeah.
Yes, exactly. That was fantastic.
So, I think we never believed in marketing. And in fact, I think before I launched Dishoom with my co-founders, I had read that book, Purple Cow, whose name the author I've forgotten, but Seth Godin. And Seth Godin. So I declared very sort of naively and a bit sort of, I just said, marketing's dead. This is rubbish. We're not doing any marketing. We're going to bake the remarkability into what we do. And it's sort of, naively, I didn't know anything about anything. But I mean, still not. But we decided, instead of doing marketing, we did a decent amount of PR. So what we thought is, let's propel word of mouth using organic social. But back then there was only organic social, basically. And let's also do stuff that bakes in the remarkability. Let's make it different and interesting. And nowadays I don't think we spend any money on above the line and digital. We have recently, because of our products business, which I think is maybe slightly different. But we'd much rather blow a whole bunch of cash on an immersive theatre production or on a record, which has paid for itself many times over, or on our book, for example, put the effort into that. And I think for us, I mean, those numbers are huge, 100 million or 150 million. I can't really sort of relate to them because we don't spend any money on above the line or digital. We sort of work on making it remarkable, build in the story, work on that, and then try and turbocharge the word of mouth to bring people in. And apparently we have a great following amongst the tech community and the creative community of Boston and San Francisco. And I don't know how that happened, but I think it's through repeat business and word of mouth and people talking about it.
So people who fly into London will actually go out of their way. It's just word of mouth through the tech community in San Jose. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I have friends there who there's friends of mine in the West Coast who sort of come to London, discovered it, mentioned it to their teams, and said, "Oh, I know Shamil, who founded Dishoom," and they're like, "Oh, I've got celeb status." And I think one of the guys was VP of Pinterest or something, running Pinterest, and he was like, "I'm a celeb now because I know you." It's ridiculous, but I found pockets of. I've just been surprised, like, how does that work? So there's sort of things happen that way, but I think it's better not to do marketing or advertising. It's a marketing conference.
Well, the glory of sort of marketing as contagion is instead of predefining who your target audience is, you discover to your immense surprise that your target audience is actually much more varied and diverse than any kind of demographic can capture, which I always think is really interesting. I always think it's a terrible mistake to go in with a complete kind of preconception over who your customers will be, because it's never that simple.
Yeah.
I've got to ask one question which intrigues me. One thing that could take the Dishoom concept on the road is a kind of food truck. Now, it would have to be a kind of eccentric vehicle, possibly accompanied by a fleet of Austin ambassadors or something. But I've always thought there's some potential there. We have a wood-fired pizza van that stops at the end of the drive here on Mondays. And I'm convinced that my daughters buy more food from it than they would if it were a restaurant open 7 days a week, simply because of the scarcity thing. It's only here once a week, so now's your chance. And I've always thought the potential for the food truck, which obviously is widely explored in LA and places like that, I think that could be extended in the UK a bit. I'm always intrigued by the possibility. Do you have any thoughts along that line?
Yeah, it's a great idea.
Or is it just very difficult to do? Is a mobile tandoori very energy hungry? I mean, Elon Musk could probably provide you with some sort of battery solution, but I'm just wondering if...
It's a good question. I think it's a great idea. I mean, we have thought about it in the past, the food truck, and it's always never made the list of strategic priorities. We've always sort of had too much to do. But actually, as I think about it, in this sort of pandemic and post-pandemic environment where we're trying to launch a products business, I mean, having a bacon naan roll truck might be just a piece of genius. You know, it rocks up in your neighborhood and the sort of ice cream bell rings, and it's the Dishoom bacon naan roll truck, which sells you the bacon naan roll kit as well as bacon naan rolls. Could be a really interesting thing to do. So I'm glad you mentioned it. I'll think about that tomorrow morning.
I'll give one tip, which is that if you focus on selling only one thing, people will pay a greater premium for it because they assume that one thing must be fantastic. There's a guy in Australia, in Sydney, who's just opened a restaurant called Wings and Tins. Okay, it's the most Australian thing imaginable. They only sell chicken wings and tins of beer. That's it. And I think, Starbucks did that because they could charge more for coffee because coffee was their lead product. It wasn't sold as a kind of, a sideline. And I think there's an interesting behavioral insight there. If you have actually a very, very limited menu of high margin products, you can. I'm terribly sorry. I've just had a voice in my ear which says I could go on all evening, as you can imagine, except for slightly have the conversation making me feel hungry. But I was just going to end. Just absolutely great to talk to you. So thanks for your time today. I can recommend the restaurant absolutely without reservation to everybody listening. If you haven't been, go. And even if you think you won't like the food, you will, or you're basically deranged. Okay, that's the first point. And it just remains for me to say that's all for this episode of On Brand. The podcast is brought to you by ALF Insight. For more information on powering your business growth, visit their website, which is at alfinsight.com. That's alfinsight.com. The series is produced and edited by Ultimate Sound and Vision, very expertly, I might add. And to make sure you receive the next episode, obviously, here's my usual plug. Please do subscribe. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard, then give us a like. So thanks for listening and immense thanks. See you soon. In person, I hope.